It's not a secret. Here in the States, the most preferred method of dealing with dead bodies is interment. But that's not the only way in which people honor their loved ones. Across cultures and continents, the act varies wildly. Far in the isolated forest in the island of Indonesia, where modern-day wonders like indoor plumbing and electricity are luxuries, there exist a people who, despite being exposed to tourism and civilized man, still maintain their archaic traditions. The Toraja occupy the mountainous region of South Swasti, though strictly speaking the religion that dominates their culture is mostly Christian, Protestant, if you must know, and what little remains of their endemic ways is just that, little. Fewer than 6% of the native inhabitants practice Aluk Tudalo, or the way of the ancestors. For the Toraja, both life and death were important to their culture. They treated their funerals or death rituals with the same respect you'd expect from anyone, but there's one small difference in how they handled their dead. They would live with them. Funerals were expensive, and if the family did not have the money, the loved one's death was postponed and arrested death development. And for days or weeks or months, and yes, even sometimes years, they lived with the corpse in their home, wrapped in a sheet, until enough money was secured to bury them properly. Just like us, they were put in a coffin, which was placed into a cave, along with all of their belongings, so that they might take them to Puya, the land of the souls. To the north lies the country of Tibet, whose people, like the Toraja, were cast into contemporary society but with disastrous results. The invading Saitung army would eviscerate the poorly armed Tibetans. The numbers aren't clear, but an estimated 1.2 million died from the invasion and subsequent occupation. The plateaus of Tibet aren't the easiest to dig. The soil is hard, much of it is comprised of metamorphic and igneous rock, so it's not surprising that occupants came up with an easy way to be rid of their dead. The sky burial was invented out of equal parts tradition and necessity. Its name literally translates to bird scattered. According to Buddhist tradition, after death, the soul departs, leaving an empty husk. The religion strongly affirms that one must have the virtues of generosity and compassion, and what better way than sustaining a life after your death? So the body is scrupulously divided with a knife and left for the vultures. Afterwards, the bones are ground into a fine flour-like powder and mixed with barley, which is fed to crows, vultures, and hawks. Traditionally, Buddhism endorses cremation, but due to the environmental restrictions, it's simply not a viable option. Burials serve many purposes for society. The obvious initial benefit is hygienic, but there's an ancillary reason. When one buries a person, they close a door on that life. Whether it's casting a body into the sea, into the earth, or scattering ashes to the sky, each one of these acts plays a therapeutic role in the lessening of suffering of those they left behind. There have been many cases throughout history where the deceased wished to be buried with their belongings. Egyptian pharaohs often requested all their possessions were sealed into their tomb, along with pets, alive or not. The famous example of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, requesting an army of soldiers carved from terracotta, which numbered in the thousands, would be entombed with him. The Viking funerals, where a boat set to sea and lit aflame, had offerings of gold, pottery, weapons, and sometimes their wives. Thankfully, these incidences are something we as modern humans don't have to deal with on a daily basis, that they are merely the superstitious delusions of ancient man. Aren't they? It was in India, the fall of 1987, in the Sikar district of Rajasthan, that Mal Singh took ill. He had been a relatively healthy man of 24, but the 1980s of India weren't known to be great, and general hygienic practices were hard to enforce with an infrastructure that was well behind the standards of the modern world. After all, 10 years prior, an illness which ravaged colonial America in the 1700s, smallpox, swept its way through the country, killing 15,000 people and permanently disfiguring 60,000. So it was no surprise when Singh contracted gastroenteritis, more commonly known as the stomach flu, which gave him both diarrhea and vomiting fits coupled with fever. It must have been too much, for he died the following day. This could have only been a shock to the newly wedded and now widowed Rup Kinwar. Yet she had little time to grieve, for her in-laws were already building a funeral pyre, and Kinwar understood the meaning behind that. So Kinwar, who had always been true to her faith, with blessings of her family and closest relatives, walked with the funeral procession accompanied by her dead husband. She then proceeded to sit atop the pyre, raised her hands, and with her own anointed will, lit it. Purportedly, there were no screams or struggle, that she had a look of tranquility as she was consumed by the fire. This is the story of those who attended the ritual claim. However, their testimonies were far from consistent. Others reported this ritual suicide was in fact a sacrifice, that the bride fled from her home and hid in a barn, but was easily found, who was then dragged into the street and thrown onto the funeral pyre, where she screamed and thrashed. One can only imagine the pain and fear she must have felt as the flames licked her clean of skin and flesh. The time of death would be at 1:30 p.m. on September 4th, 1987. She was 18 years old. The initial investigations couldn't prove whether Kinwar was forced or was a willing participant, so of the 45 who were charged with murder, not one conviction was made. Her death would go on to create a law, the Rajasthan Sati Prevention Ordinance in 1987, the Commission of Sati Prevention Act in the same year. The law is written thusly: the burning or burying alive of 1. Any widow along with the body of her deceased husband or any other relative, or with any article, object, or thing associated with the husband or such relative, or 2. Any woman along with the body of any of her relatives, irrespective of whether such burning or burying is claimed to be voluntary on the part of the widow or the women or otherwise. I wish I could say this would be the end of these barbarous acts, but as I stated earlier, this was India, who even today failed to meet many standards one would expect from a nation whose economy and GDP are rapidly becoming first world. Through the coming years, there would be incidents of widow burning. The areas were mostly rural, to be fair, and they far and few in between, but there was one incident which caught attention of the media. In the fall of 2006, reportedly by the Daily Mail, Taipei Times, and the Press Trust of India, there came a report of sati of a 95-year-old woman, Korea Devi, a recent widow and mother of 4, allegedly, like so many before, threw herself onto her husband's funeral pyre. But there was a catch. The 95-year-old could barely walk without assistance, let alone jump atop a pyre that was 5 feet high. In an eerily similar set of events, like Rup Kinwar before, 2 versions of a story came from the incident. The first stated that Devi willingly killed herself, while the other states that her 4 sons tossed her body into the searing fire. Out of the 20 witnesses and 4 alleged murderers, no one was convicted. When one of the brothers was questioned by the police, he simply stated, "I had no idea sati was illegal, and I regard it as an act of honor."